I know that there's so many things going on. There are 10 candidates who are coming into the art department for hire to be hired, and they're going to hire 2 people. And so there's an awful lot going on, and so we're really thrilled that you were able to come this afternoon. As you know, this is part of the Tandem Press Department of Art Visiting Artists series, and I'd like to acknowledge the generosity of the Anonymous Fund, which made this lecture possible. We're extremely honoured to welcome back David Klamen to Madison, where he's now working on 2 new prints. He worked on a print with us a couple of years ago, which was incredibly successful, and we're delighted that he has come back again. David was born in 1961, and he received his BFA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and his MFA from the School of the Art Institute. His work is in the collections of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Cranard Art Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum, and abroad in the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Seoul, Korea. He's had solo exhibitions in Chicago, New York, and Italy, and has participated in numerous group exhibitions throughout the United States. For anybody who's traveling to New York, he currently has a show on in New York at the moment.
That's correct.
Which you can see. David Klamen's imagery deals with landscapes, still lifes, architecture, interiors, as well as images and symbols of apparent associations, language, and cultural codes. He combines vibrant, reflective surfaces and layers of rich monochromatic tonalities. But in the end, his work is about visual appeal. The last time I introduced David, I spoke a little bit about his work, but then when I heard his most eloquent talk, I decided tonight that I would let the artist speak for himself. So please join me in welcoming David Klamen back to Tandem Press. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh. Okay. Since this is an educational environment, the slides that I put together to show you and the talk that I'm giving is really geared towards helping students understand how I got to making the work that I'm making now. I always remember as a student seeing guest artists coming in and showing their work and talking about what they're doing and trying to figure out, well, how'd they get from doing those academic drawings and a drawing class where the first few times they're sort of experimenting with abstraction to the work they're at now. So I've included work in this talk that begins from when I was 19, I believe. A few other things to say before we start actually looking at work is I'm very hesitant to give too flat-footed of an answer to the question, what does an image mean? I never really simply say, this painting means this. And the reason for that is well, there's several reasons for it. One of them is that's not really how meaning works in artworks or many other things. Meaning usually is a more subtle and complex relationship between a person's own experience and what that image sort of does with them. But there's another reason that haunts me and keeps me from saying those kinds of things too simply, and that's that I've noticed over the years as I talk about my work, the things that I say the works mean or were about change. I'll look at works from 15 years ago, and at the time I made it, I was quite confident that I knew what it meant. And now I look at it again, and I'm again quite confident that I know what it means. It's just something else. And so I know that something's shifting and something's moving with how and what these works mean. And so I leave that a little bit open-ended. What I try and do is to give you enough information that's relevant and helpful enough so that perhaps you can see them a little bit through my eyes. In short, I don't really want to turn the works just into an illustration of what I say, but I want to leave them, so they have the potential to mean something to you as well. With that, I'm going to go on to the first slide. As Paula had mentioned, I began studying art at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. I went there straight from high school. I was 18 years old, and actually I was studying biochemical communications, which is a mixture of science and the arts. I was interested in possibly a career in illustrating medical books. And I had spent a year studying anatomy, studying science. I loved the science, but I didn't really like the academic drawing part. as much. I was, for whatever reason, able to draw accurately right away as a student. And after about 6 months or a year of drawing bones in the figure, it started to lose interest to me, and it started to become more mechanical. And I had my first sort of personal artistic rebellion when I was 19 years old. I decided that I wasn't interested in just depicting something that I could already see with my own eyes. And I went on a university trip to Europe and spent a few months looking at art across Italy, Austria, and Germany, and Switzerland. And this drawing somewhat came out of the blue. It is really quite unlike anything else that I'd done before. The work I had done before it looks like the work you did your freshman year in your figure drawing class, essentially academic studies. This drawing began as a drawing of Michelangelo's David in Florence from a sketchbook page. It's roughly 8 by 12 or 14 inches. And I had spent the day sketching sculptures and looking at art, and was back at, I was staying at a campground in a van, looking at my sketches, disappointed in the fact that my drawing of Michelangelo's David could never be as good as Michelangelo's David. At best, it was a copy. And so I erased the drawing, and I used some of the imagery and some of the forms and a lot of inspiration from a design exercise I had in a class to make this drawing. I didn't have any answer to the question, why was this an important image, or what did this mean? I just knew that there was something compelling about it to me, and that it felt like it was mine, not an imitation of something of someone else's. So with that, I really rebelled. I said, okay, I'm not interested in realistic art. I'm not going to draw anything realistically. In fact, I didn't even think there was any interesting art before 1880 at that point. I was just going to focus on abstraction and those qualities that made the artwork an independent thing, not reliant on some other outside subject. This turned into a series of drawings. Again, this is my sophomore year at University of Illinois. And I started to think more and more about what it was that was interesting to me about them, looking at them, coming up with answers to the question, what does this mean, so that I could sort of satisfy people who are asking me, and maybe myself to some extent. At the time, I was politically motivated, and I had answers about contingent social structures and some sort of political connotation to it. When I look back at them now, that's not what I see. What I see is me trying to answer the question, who am I as an artist? And what is this that I can show to myself? Like, how can I create a mirror to myself as an artist so that I can try and figure out who I am? In fact, as part of these, I would literally time myself when I began them. I would give myself 2 minutes and a ruler to draw all the lines. And then after I would draw the basic straight lines, I would say, okay, now how can I fill in these shapes in order to amplify and intensify those compositional elements that made this intriguing to me to begin with? The reason I think I was doing that is I was trying to document my own sense of design, trying to find out what it was that drew me towards abstraction. They slowly began to have nuances of representational imagery that was included in them. As much as I tried to keep it out, it seemed to be there. Am I going the same direction? Yeah. Some of them even became a little bit more architectural. I, at this point, decided that I wanted to try my hand at sculpture and to try and make one of these more architectural forms on a much larger scale. In fact, I wanted to make it the size of a house. And knowing that I really couldn't do that, and it was just a complete impossibility, I decided that what I would do was do a painting of it, sort of a study for a sculpture. This painting is 5 foot square. I was so desperate not to be part of the tradition of painting and the tradition of art history that I didn't use any traditional artist materials, no oil paint. I didn't use brushes. I used spray cans in my hands and masking tape. And I set out to sort of construct this piece of architecture. My rationale for being able to do this was that this was really just a plan for a sculpture. But it led to more studies for sculptures that were really just paintings that I exhibited as paintings. I became interested in some of the qualities and things that were happening with the paint in itself. At the time, I was still thinking about social structures, closed off architecture as some kind of a metaphor for different social classes and things that were closed off seemingly to me. Again, as I look back at them now, I reflect on them more as sort of metaphors for myself, sort of slightly animated self-portraits. I guess I should add it. When I was 19, I was pathologically shy, and I got to think that had something to do with painting these things with no doors and no windows and closed off, and trying to reconcile that in my work somehow. Oops, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. This next image was my first painting I did at graduate school. This was at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. The Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago had just had an exhibition entitled Dogs. And this exhibition was roughly based on the idea that dogs are an overwhelmingly common and important symbol in the art world, usually aggressive, hostile dogs that embodied the disenfranchised or discontent spirit of artists. And I actually thought that it was kind of a silly idea. Not as much a silly idea. I thought the paintings that were in the show weren't that interesting to me. And that and some friends teasing me saying, look, Klamen, as soon as you go to Chicago, the first thing you're going to do is paint dogs so you can be part of this crowd. I felt that I had to paint a painting with a dog in it. And the title of the painting was Licking the Hand That Feeds You. And it was about the idea of painting dogs. It was about the idea of trying to make imagery that was self-consciously rebellious, and in a way it sort of fit the idea of, well, an artist is supposed to be rebellious on some level. But it also clearly sort of was connected to my older work. I was still not using brushes. I was still painting it with combs and sticks and spray cans. And the dog area is just a pencil drawing on the canvas. The scale of this piece is about 7 by 9 feet. So it's fairly large. It's continued on as a sort of series of works that were related to these architectural images, still spraying things. I was sort of amazed with what would happen with these different materials when they would kind of spontaneously meet on the canvas. I had begun exhibiting my work while a student at the Art Institute, and a number of these pieces were exhibited in shows, in galleries, a few of them in museums. And I was getting feedback on my work for the first time, meaningful feedback, helpful feedback. And one thing that I noticed is that one of the things that was being talked about is the fact that they aren't being painted with a brush and using traditional artist materials. I had rejected that because I didn't want to be part of that sort of dialogue of painters. And I also rejected it because I always thought brushstrokes were a really silly thing to talk about. What was the point of it? I don't think that now, by the way. I think they're terribly important. But at the time, I thought that I didn't want to be part of that. And really what was happening is people were talking about my work as, well, look at the way it's painted. That was much more relevant to people than the image. So I gave up, and I bought oil paints, and I was amazed at just how lush and friendly and magic oil paint is. How it's impossible to force it to do something, but if you sort of go with it, it can do things that, well, as you can see, the paintings instantly became somewhat softer and more romantic and more animated. I look back at these, and it's still hard for me to believe about that I didn't consciously admit to myself or talk about them as being psychological self-portraits. But that's absolutely how I see them now. If I come back and I give another talk on this in the future, I'll probably say something different, but I'm convinced of that now. Without talking about it or telling anyone, I was making these mountains in the background, thinking of them as almost like the backs of animals. And these houses or architectural structures were all animated in some somewhat lifelike way. This is towards the end of graduate school for me. And in fact, this painting is the last painting I did in graduate school, and the first painting of the rest of my life. A whole series of works that came after it. This painting had, well, let me talk about just technically how it was done, is a painting that was painted in full contrast, a very sort of volumetric, solid painting of this antelope, half house, that was then varnished with a mixture of Damar varnish, stand oil, and a little pigment over and over and over again, maybe 25 times. Varnish after varnish until the image was virtually gone. This photo is overexposed about 1.5 stops. In normal gallery lighting, the image is considerably darker than this, near black. And it was an image that was buried, almost lost. I was sort of doing the opposite of what conservators do, cleaning off that varnish to reveal it. I was making an image and hiding it. There were a couple of things that led me to this. One of them is I went back to Europe, and I noticed, and I probably shouldn't say this because it sounds like I don't appreciate art history, because I do, and I love Caravaggio and these people. But I noticed that when I was in Italy, that there are places in churches where you have to put a coin in a machine to have the light go on to see the paintings. And I discovered that if I didn't have the light on, there was something magic about these paintings. I could only see the fluctuations of the surface and the variations of the surface, and I would try and imagine, I know what painting was there, and I'd try and imagine what the image was and think about it to myself. And there was a kind of process where my expectations became molded with the image that must be lurking in that painting and the surface of the painting that I could see. And I became almost like a participant in rebuilding this painting. And then when someone would come by and put the coin in the light, and the light would come on, I sometimes felt like I was seeing a big version of the photograph that I'd seen so many times before. It just seemed too revealing somehow. And I became interested in this process of trying to engage yourself in uncovering an image. I was also at this time studying hermeneutics. It's a field that's called interpretation theory. It addresses how we know things and how we interpret things. It was influencing me quite a bit. I also had just read the book Moby Dick, which is a book that's very much about slow disclosure. You read for 500 pages before you get to this whale. Even early in the book, Ishmael has an event where he goes into a bar, and behind the bar there's a painting which, because of the poor lighting and because it's been varnished so many times, is so dark you can't make out what the image is. So Ishmael asks the sailors in the room, do you know what this is a painting of? And they all had a story about it, but nobody really knew what the image was. So he finally asked the bartender, and they all got together and they held up their lights and they threw open a window at the back of the bar, and they realized that it was a painting of a whale. And the slow disclosure of that became much more interesting to me than the whale. I wanted to make paintings that somehow played with that. So this was the first of them, where I would take an image and bury it under layer after layer of paint. The images that are included in these, by the way, are stuffed animals from natural history museums. I love animals just fine, probably as much as a normal person, but I'm not an animal painter. I don't always even know what kinds of animals they are. I'm not that interested in the animal. What I'm interested in is the diorama and the representation of nature in a museum. The idea that I've learned about what animals are through reproductions in some way, and I'm sort of fascinated about things being shown to me through reproductions. And I wasn't making a painting of nature, I was making a painting of a sculpture, sort of nature, of a reproduction of nature. So each of these are animals that were stuffed in dioramas. This is one where I cleaned each time I'd varnish it, I would clean the varnish off the back of the antelope. so that the varnish, that part of the painting is as bright as it was when I first began the painting. I wanted to make an image that was, at first, a little bit elusive, that you could see something bright, but you couldn't quite tell what it was. That it led you in one way of sort of being drawn in and thinking this is an abstract image, that this is also a hidden image, that as you spent more time with it, you realized that it would disclose itself more slowly. I also, on a number of my paintings, began fiddling with adding extra imagery. Like in this case, there's a music staff on the top. One reason I did that, at least I think now, is probably not the answer I would have given at the time, was I didn't want people to make the mistakes of thinking these were like wildlife paintings. I didn't want them to be seen as this is a painting that's being done so that we can see what a beautiful animal this is. I wanted to be clear that I was more interested in metaphorical issues and the abstract qualities of it as well. Another reason why I think I came to music staves is this. I'm trying to think of a way that's not too eccentric to say this, but one question I ask myself when I'm working is I ask myself, what does this sound like? Or if this was sound, what would this painting sound like? And the answer I'm always giving myself with this body of work is I want it to be silent. In fact, around this time I discovered that I have a small degree of synesthesia, which means I always assumed it was something everyone had, but it was that I experienced the wrong sense through the wrong sense organ sometimes. If I close my eyes and clap my hands, I see sparks or flashes of light. It's not that uncommon, but it was something that was related to my work in some way, that I wanted to have these things be silent. I equated the two somehow. So the music staffs without notes was a part of that. This is a much smaller piece. Most of these pieces have been roughly 6 by 8 feet. This is maybe 2.5 by 3.5 feet. Again, these are all still stuffed animals. You get a bit of sense of the scale from the paint cans at the bottom. When I look at this image now, and you'll see at the very end these striped images, I'm sort of surprised to see the connection between this and some of the things that are coming later, where I was flirting with these abstract elements, these almost modernist elements. When I think of high modernism in the 50s, I think of these incredible striped paintings that alluded to these transcendental abstract truths somehow. The stripes of so many of the great modern artists, and how I was sort of flirting with that at this stage. This is also a much smaller one. If you go to the Field Museum in Chicago, you can see about half of those images. I also began looking at a different type of imagery. I did a series of paintings where I would go to the entryways to departments of philosophy, theology, and museums, and use that as my subject. At this point, I was still particularly interested in making paintings that drew attention to our active interpretation, that made us self-conscious that we're part of constructing the meaning of the artwork, and that we're part of a relationship with the artwork. And I wanted to look at another source, another place, those places that sort of taught us how to know things, taught us the ways in which we can call something valid knowledge. And so I looked to museums and departments of philosophy and theology. This is the University of Chicago. And a number of these paintings, this is Northwestern, I continued painting imagery over the top of the varnish. This one, the division symbol. On most of these that has the image on top, the division symbol is one of the only ones that is literally a symbol. Most of them aren't symbols. They're either objects or completely abstract shapes. And there was a couple reasons why I did this. One of them is I wanted to make the paintings darker. And if I put one more varnish on it, they didn't get darker, they just went away. And I found that by contrast, if I had something that was quite bright on top, that it would make by contrast the rest of it somehow feel like it was further back. And it would give us this experience of seeing one thing that seems so physical, so present with us, something that was right there and then we could touch. And then the rest of this image was like a memory, well, almost a lost memory, something that was in the past, something that was beneath the varnish. And I usually tried to find things that were incommensurate, that didn't sort of use the same language as each other. Things like a division symbol, which is you can't really paint a picture of a division symbol in a way. I mean, a division symbol is a completely abstract concept. You can't literally depict it. And I tried to form it and make it like a tube. Or, in this case, a Chinese vase, an ancient Chinese vase, where it's really kind of out of place or been relocated for the paintings to this entryway at the University of Illinois, to the Department of Philosophy, in the context of a painting which, using this varnish, feels so Western. To use something that's so Eastern as another way to sort of play with these two different incommensurate things. This image that seems so immediate and so physical compared to these images which are lost underneath. Sometimes as a starting point I would just document the path I took to get to that part of the building. This is Lincoln Hall at the University of Illinois. Just on a sort of technical thing, when I was making these paintings, I would always finish the varnished part and I'd have no idea what was going to go on top, if anything would go on top. And I would paint things on acetate, and I still do this. I paint things on clear plastic and then I move them around and sometimes photograph them, put them in a computer and draw on top of them and live with them a while before I sort of decide which of the things seems to resolve the painting. This is the Field Museum, the Natural History Museum in Chicago, the place where the images of the animals were, nearly half of them were taken from. In this case, it's the pillar that was left unvarnished. By this point on, all the works that you'll see for the rest of my slides are roughly done at the same time. Around this time or soon after that, we're still a few slides away, but it'll become apparent in 5 minutes. I gave up the idea of, I lost interest in the idea of making works that sort of fit within a unified visual body of work. I really took it on myself in a much more committed fashion to first make the work that I found most interesting to me. I go to my studio in the morning and I ask myself the question, what do I want to paint today? And I honestly paint what feels most compelling to me. But I also let the work be motivated more by ways of answering certain questions rather than any kind of visual continuity. At this point, I was looking further into this question of how we know things and how do we know things. And I decided to start testing different strategies for that. Different methods for, this by the way is the Art Institute in Chicago, different methods that we have for kind of answering, well, how do you know something? One of those answers is empiricism. You know something by looking at it and documenting your experience. In this case, I literally set up a still life in my studio and sat down in front of it and painted what I saw. Now obviously this is making all kinds of references to the Western tradition of painting and Dutch still lifes and still plays with that slow disclosure of the image because part of it seems unreasonably highlighted. I was using this idea in my mind of trying to know the validity of what I saw there and asking myself the question if I could see the world in any way other than highlighted by the headlights of what I was looking at, of my own vision. And I maybe even took it a little bit literally and illuminated the parts that I was really focusing on visually, which led to a group of still lifes essentially done in my studio. that still have that kind of slight vacancy, that quite ambiguity, that little bit of ambiguity between what's present here, like in this case the tablecloth feels present on the front of the canvas and the rest of it feels somehow lost in our memory. A number of them were also landscapes. I began playing with another way of knowing things, and that's by using my memory. Trying to remember my earliest memories, my most formative memories. In this case, the landscape behind the house where I grew up, which is in rural Illinois, and painting it from memory and varnishing it until it's, well, as foggy as my memory might be of that place, and painting something on top of it which obstructs it. Sort of making a comparison between those things that are lost in my memory and those things that I know are here now, like something as rational and as present as like a neon tube. This one I actually varnished using blue tint to the varnish instead. I'd actually had an accident at this point in my life, and I had post-concussion syndrome that was bad enough that caused light-induced migraines whenever I was in bright sunlight. It's really kind of a coincidence. I was doing these really dark paintings, and I would get migraines when I was in bright light. But one way to avoid migraine headaches was I wore cobalt blue goggles whenever I went outside for several years. And I have this piece of my life that in my memory is kind of cobalt blue. And as a piece to sort of commemorate that, I varnished this piece in blue. This took a very different approach to answering the question, how do I know things? This painting uses an Eastern philosophy called daimoku. And daimoku is a Buddhist term that means seeking enlightenment or ultimate knowledge through repetitious chanting. So this image began by painting a very accurate painting of the house, of the landscape behind the house where I grew up. Another image from memory, essentially. And instead of chanting each chant to seek enlightenment, I would use instead one small spot of white paint as a sort of to supplant the chant, as like a prayer. And I started in the upper left-hand corner, and I finished in the bottom right-hand corner. And I spent a month with thousands and thousands of tiny white dots until what ended up happening is the image became almost completely hidden. And it became kind of complexly, well, in some ways I see it as huge, like a constellation of stars. And then in other times I see it as small, like molecules. I didn't end up enlightened having finished it, but I did end up incredibly attached to the painting. In fact, I kept this one. This was another sort of group of work that I've been doing where this is an installation piece that's roughly maybe 10 by 20, some 22 feet, 25 feet. This one's up in New York now. And as I would go to my studio each day, asking myself the question, what do I want to paint today? I often found that I would make these little paintings of landscapes and then sand them away. And I was more interested in what happened, when the painting was gone. So it was just a remnant, just like a ghost. But it seemed so elusive, so fragmented that I can't imagine that anyone would be able to really appreciate it in the same sense that I was. And so I found that if I put a number of them together, the commonalities, the relationships between each one of these paintings started to highlight the qualities that I found interesting. And became like a library of all these sort of individual experiences that I had. And so I began making these as site-specific installations, sort of almost like 19th century salon-style hangings of these groups of works, but I show them only as single pieces. Those large-scale pieces led me to start exploring making small studies, thinking, well, you know, I should see what my options are with these and make some small watercolor studies. And I only did several of them, and I realized that there was something interesting about the watercolor that made me think of making watercolors, not as studies, but exploring watercolor and what it had to offer, and the sort of play of how I knew things. This image, by the way, is about 8 by 11 inches, and each one of these little things is postage stamp size watercolors. And what I discovered is that if I would take a small rectangle and I would run a piece of ink, and I would saturate that rectangle with water or a little bit of watercolor mixed with the water, and I'd run my brush with ink across the bottom, the capillary effect of the paper would suck the ink up, and it would make these little landscapes. I didn't actually paint trees, it would just make these little landscapes, and if I'd pick the brush up, a tree would pop out, and if I'd run it across, then it would be a flat landscape. And coincidentally, it almost always ended up looking like the landscape behind the house where I grew up. It makes me think if I would have grown up in California, I'd do this and a palm tree would pop out. But they became almost like Rorschach tests for me. They were, a funny way where time and again I could do this, and I would, be sort of reminded that this is a deeply ingrained set of images for me. It's led to quite a number of small watercolors. Some of them, instead of making horizontal lines of ink that would turn into landscapes, I just drop an ink in the dot in the center. This time using red ink. And again, it would become evocative and suggestive of a number of things. Like, this one, depending on who's looking at it, sees a blood test and Japanese flags. I had somebody nickname this piece the Al Capone piece. Another way for me to play with this question of how I know things was to play with the idea of how image gets digitized, or information gets digitized, and how we can use that kind of digitization to convey meaning. I used as a source barcodes. This piece is the UPS designation for Gary, Indiana. And what I've done is I've actually blown it up, traced it exactly onto another piece of paper, and then painted it as a watercolor. And I was particularly interested in how they sort of flirted with that transcendent idea of modernist abstraction. Those stripes of Barnett Newman, and I think there's something so transcendent about those things. Like you can't really say exactly what they're about, but it's important, and it's monumental, and it's spiritual in some level. But it's also so elusive. And I wanted to make pieces that, I didn't want to make fun of that. I love those paintings, and they're important to me. And I wanted to make paintings that played with that included some of that sense of touch and the bleed of watercolor and the spontaneity that can only happen through touching paper with your hand. But I also wanted to have something that sort of had the end game of interpretive clarity. These have absolute concrete interpretive clarity on one level, because you can take a scanner and you can scan the painting and it'll say Gary, Indiana on your scanner. So they're absolute, and so I titled them what the barcode is. This is Commonwealth Plaza, my home address. I've done a number of, they're essentially landscapes, because I'll take the UPS code for something delivered to a specific location. This is a French-English dictionary. This is Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. A number of these pieces also weren't literally barcodes, but I wanted to take the sort of feel that came with these barcodes, the sort of feel of it's almost op art. I wanted them to teeter on the line between something that's slightly in bad taste, like op art is, maybe it is, and something that it's really in the most highbrow of work of that modern abstraction. I wanted to make pieces that sort of flirted with that edge between the two, where in some sense it had unlike op art, I wanted these to be all about my touch. Unlike my earlier work when I was an undergraduate, I wanted these to be all about the sensitivity of what it took for me to actually touch the paper with a brush and how it bled. But I also wanted it to sort of flirt with that kind of op-y feel. These are all roughly 8 by 12 inches, so they're quite small. But they led to a large series. Well, actually, these were all going on at a similar time. This painting is 8 by 12 feet and includes an image of the death of Socrates by David. Sort of a cross between a painting by David and a barcode. And I wanted to again make images that sort of combined two things that, like interpretive clarity and modernism. Two things that don't necessarily make sense together. Something like paintings by David and modernism, the stripes of modernism and digitized imagery. Images that sort of flirted with letting you see the image, sort of reminded you of art history. In this case, in particular, I was led to this image because of Socrates' idea of form. Long story short, form for Socrates is the transcendent truth of the world. And you can never really see form with your eyes. You can only reason your way to it. And only the most enlightened people can reason their way to understanding pure form. In contrast, modernism held that form was something that you could only see with your eyes and didn't have anything to do with your reason. That form, significant form, was something that was important because of just the visual experience you had. It's pure opticality. So I wanted to make a piece that is motivated by that, to try and combine these two things together. This is the actual painting that it began from. I took the slide and projected it and traced it, and then would make the stripes. This again is 8 by 12 feet. It's Arctic Shipwreck by Caspar David Friedrich, a piece that was all about the transcendent power of nature, about how nature is God's creation and ought to be feared and respected. And as a painting, Friedrich's painting is a painting that I love and admire. And this is a sort of play on it again, with those transcendent idea of stripes, trying to combine the two. That's where it was taken from. This is Frederick Church's Niagara Falls. This is about 18 feet long. It's really a very large piece. Again, this is sort of almost a play on the idea of the sublime power and complexity of mathematics, stripes, and nature. That's the image it was taken from. And this is David's The Oath of the Horatii. This painting is painted in a slightly different way than the other ones. This is painted in a much more sort of touch-sensitive, a little bit looser way, trying to bring back some of the touch of the watercolors into these larger canvas paintings. And this is the last image that I've included. I think it's important to keep in mind that with my work, from the last 5 or 10 of the dark varnished pieces to these last images that I've just shown you, these are not in order. I'll do a dark varnished piece, and then I'll make a striped piece, and then I'll do a watercolor. I really am motivated more by exploring and expanding this idea that's compelling me to make these paintings than I am in trying to create a visually unified body of work. In my mind, they're really cohesive because they're all about the same thing. I don't know if anyone would ever know that unless they read the catalog or they heard me say something about them. But even now, day to day, I'm still sort of exploring different answers to that question of visual epistemology, and reading different sources which help me try to find answers to that question. With that, I'd just like to answer any questions, if anybody has any. Yes?
You mentioned that you like to read different sources about visual epistemology. I don't know, have you gotten into phenomenology?
Just a little bit.
Some of the dark varnish pieces particularly really make me think of a way phenomenologists analyze perception as a relationship between subjects rather than as a subject and object.
Well, the little bit of experience I've had with phenomenology, and I've only read just a little bit, and I heard a book on tape about it. And when I heard it and read a little bit, I thought, you know what? This sounds like if I were to explore it, it would look like my work.
Yeah.
It really did seem to make a connection to that.
Well, you must have the idea when you've been painting some of those dark varnish pieces and then putting the bright object on them. You must end up having, especially given the scale that they're on, basically viewer-size scale, as I understand it, that those objects are looking at you while you're looking at them.
Yeah.
That kind of happens from a phenomenological point of view when you get into kind of very critical perception.
I think some of that might have been internalized for me because I did read a little bit of it while I was a student, and I think it helped sort of.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily something that you have to experience or come at from a theoretical point of view, but those paintings particularly, I would think it would really happen.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably right, and it makes me feel I should read more of that because that is the direction that when I list my sources for my work, my influences, they're not visual artists, they're writers.
Yeah,
I mean, that's sort of how it works for me usually. What other questions can I answer? Yes?
What kind of prints are you making?
Well, the first prints that I did the first print I did at Tandem was much like the watercolors with the multiple images, and included 98 separate etchings, all printed on one page. The one that I'm doing, the two that I'm working on right now are a lot like this. In fact, one of them is a variation of this image by David. I'm doing two images by David, these striped images. And what I'm essentially doing is taking a copper plate and projecting the image on it, drawing the image on it, covering it with a sheet of contact paper, and then using an X-Acto knife, I'm cutting out each one of those shapes, and then we're etching it in acid. We're still working on cutting out the shapes. So they're in the spirit of these.
Are you able to support yourself by selling your own art?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate. I have been. Well, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, I've been very fortunate with that, and I have all of the works that we've seen here, except for the one that I kept or sold. I'm going to add to that. I'm also a professor at Indiana University, and while it certainly doesn't make financial sense for me to teach, what it does make for me is I can't imagine painting freely and as diversely as I do, having the sense that my well-being and financial well-being is resting on the end of my brush. I feel like I'm free to paint however I want because, you know what, if I never sell another painting, it's not really going to influence my lifestyle because I'm a professor. I have a life of contact with my colleagues and my students that's really meaningful and important to me, and a steady income that that frees me in my studio to be adventurous in a way that I don't know if I could be if I didn't teach. So deep down inside, I'm kind of committed to being an academic. Anything else?
Well, I'd like to, on behalf of everybody, thank David for a wonderful talk, and thank you very much for coming back, and you're all welcome to come to Tandem Press and see the prints.